The hall was alive with glitter and noise, the kind of gathering where wealth was flaunted as much as the diamonds on display. Every laugh rang a little too loudly. Every glance lingered a little too long, as though the guests needed constant reassurance that they were still the most powerful people in the room. Silver trays swept through clusters of tuxedos and gowns, while cameras flashed in the corners, feeding egos as much as they captured them. And then, a silence cut through the glamour. Heads turned in unison, as if drawn by an invisible thread. A woman had just stepped through the entrance, alone. Her dress was elegant but not extravagant, her posture steady, her eyes refusing to dart nervously the way outsiders usually did in such a place. She didn't shrink, she didn't beg to belong, she simply walked forward. The ripple of whispers spread quickly. Some guests leaned into each other with smirks, others raised their glasses as though mocking a toast. Bones came out, not to honor her, but to record her. Within moments, she wasn't a guest anymore, she was entertainment. And the family at the center of it all, the hosts of the night, were watching closely, already sharpening their smiles. If you're watching this right now, take a quick second to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more stories like this. And let me know in the comments which country you're watching from. I'd love to see how far our community reaches. Back in the hall, the temperature shifted. One of the women from the host family tilted her chin, whispering something that set off a round of laughter near the bar. Their son raised his glass toward the lone woman, his smirk dripping with arrogance. Each step she took seemed to irritate them more, like her quiet confidence was louder than the string quartet echoing across the marble floor. And then, without warning, the glass tipped. Red liquid arcs through the air, splattering across her gown. Laughter broke out in waves, sharp and cruel. A voice rang clear above it all. "You don't belong here." The room froze, waiting to see if she would crumble. But she didn't. She simply lifted her chin. The laughter that followed the wine spill echoed against marble floors polished to a mirror's shine. But beneath the noise, the setting itself seemed to demand attention. Towering glass windows revealed the Manhattan skyline, skyscrapers glowing against the night like beacons of power. Crystal chandeliers glittered above, scattering sharp flecks of light across tables draped in white silk. Rows of champagne flutes caught the glow, turning liquid gold into shimmering displays. Everywhere you looked, excess had been turned into a performance. The Hollisters stood at the center of it all, as though the ballroom had been constructed around them. Victoria Hollister, tall and striking in her emerald gown, wore her jewels as if they were medals earned through conquest. Beside her, Charles Hollister leaned on the confidence of old money, his tuxedo fitted to perfection, his smile practiced for photographers. Their children flanked them. Preston with his glass permanently half full, smirk sharpened from years of entitlement, and Isabella whispering daggers behind a flawless smile. Together they projected the image of a dynasty untouchable. That illusion wavered the moment Celeste Morgan entered the room. She wasn't draped in sequins or gemstones. Her dress was midnight blue, simple in cut, its elegance resting in restraint rather than extravagance. The hem brushed the marble floor as she walked, and though the stain from the spilled wine spread across the fabric like an open wound, she held herself with the ease of someone who understood that dignity couldn't be stripped by fabric. Her hair was swept back in a knot, silver earrings her only ornament. No bodyguards trailed her, no assistant hovered nearby. She carried only a small black clutch, one hand resting lightly at her side, the other steady as she advanced further into the room. Every step was measured. Not timid, not rushed, measured. The crowd responded like an organism unsettled by a foreign presence. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. A senator's wife tilted her head and muttered, "Who invited her?" A banker's son sneered, "Must be staff. Look at her dress." Someone chuckled, loud enough to draw others into the rhythm of mockery. Phones lit up. Screens glowed as lenses zoomed in on her gown, on the stain, on the audacity of a woman who didn't bow when ridiculed. Guests posted quick captions that reduced her existence to a joke. Gatecrasher, charity case, wrong ballroom. Yet she didn't falter. Her shoulders squared against the rising tide of laughter, her chin lifted as if to remind the room that she had as much right to breathe its air as anyone standing there. That quiet defiance unsettled those who thrived on spectacle. It was easier to crush someone who begged for acceptance. Harder when the target didn't blink. Victoria's gaze narrowed. She adjusted the diamond choker at her throat and turned toward the woman in the stained gown. Beside her, Preston chuckled loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "If she's hoping to blend in," he said, swirling his champagne, "she's already failing." His companions erupted, delighting in cruelty disguised as wit. Isabella leaned toward a guest at her side. "Probably wandered in looking for the kitchen," she whispered. The ripple of laughter spread again. But even as the room turned sharper, Celeste kept walking. Her eyes didn't dart nervously. They fixed on the Hollisters, steady, unwavering. She walked into the very center of the storm, into their circle, without breaking stride. By the time she stopped, the air itself felt taut. Whispers had reached every corner of the hall, feeding curiosity and contempt alike. The Hollisters stood waiting, smiles thin, postures poised for the pleasure of dismantling someone they considered beneath them. And yet, for a fleeting second, a hush fell. Because even covered in wine, even surrounded by scorn, the woman before them didn't look small. She looked unmovable, and that unsettled them more than any outburst ever could. The tension that had simmered since Celeste Morgan walked into the ballroom reached its breaking point near the buffet table. A young man, glass in hand, leaned a little too far as she passed. The liquid leapt out in a scarlet arc, soaking into the dark fabric of her gown. The room gasped, then burst into laughter as if humiliation had been choreographed for their amusement. Preston Hollister didn't bother to hide his smirk. "Oh, now," he said in mock sympathy, raising his half-empty glass as though offering a toast. "Looks like someone isn't ready for fine company." His friends clapped him on the back, roaring with laughter, not out of humor but cruelty sharpened by arrogance. Victoria Hollister seized the moment. Her heels clicked across the marble like gavel strikes, commanding attention even before she spoke. Her diamonds glittered against the emerald fabric of her gown as she stopped within arm's reach of Celeste. She tilted her head, letting silence hang long enough to gather an audience. Then, her voice cut clean across the room. "You don't belong here." It wasn't said quietly. It wasn't whispered in shame. It was declared, deliberate, loud, meant to sting. The phrase carried across the hall, settling into ears already eager for gossip. Guests leaned in closer, their laughter quickening, feeding off the hostility as though it were fuel. Someone near the bar raised their phone, framing Celeste in their lens. Others followed, eager to capture her discomfort, to broadcast her place in the world with a single humiliating clip. A murmur spread, hashtags already forming in the air before they ever reached a screen. And yet, she didn't flinch. She didn't reach for napkins. She didn't protest the spill. She didn't try to explain herself or retreat into the shadows. Her shoulders stayed squared, her chin lifted, her eyes steady as they met Victoria's. The silence she held was louder than the insults surrounding her. The crowd grew restless. Their laughter sharpened, then faltered when it became clear she wouldn't break. Preston raised his glass again, determined to push her past composure. "Careful with the silverware," he sneered. "Wouldn't want the help to get confused." His companions nearly doubled over, tears of mock laughter forming at the corners of their eyes. Isabella Hollister didn't shout. Her cruelty was quieter, more insidious. She leaned toward a nearby guest, her lips curved in a practiced smile. "She must have slipped past security," she murmured just loud enough for others to hear. "Probably staff pretending to belong." The whisper carried, spreading like wildfire. Soon, guests were nodding, laughing, repeating the lie as though it were truth. Phones zoomed in closer, their lenses catching the ruined fabric, the scarlet stain, the quiet figure who refused to collapse under the weight of mockery. A man near the back muttered, "She'll be gone before dessert." Another laughed. "If they let her stay that long." Even the guards shifted uneasily, waiting for Victoria's inevitable order. Her lips curled, satisfied with the spectacle she had created. To her, this wasn't just about one woman in a gown. It was about reminding everyone in the room who had the power to decide who was worthy and who was disposable. But the moment stretched longer than expected. The crowd leaned closer, waiting for Celeste to crack. Tears, anger, outrage, any reaction would have fed the performance. Instead, there was only silence. Her silence was not submission, it was defiance. And in that silence, the air began to shift. The guests didn't recognize it yet. Neither did the Hollisters. But humiliation, once unleashed, can turn. What they saw as weakness was something far more dangerous, an unshaken resolve waiting to strike. The silence Celeste carried in that ballroom wasn't born there. It had been carved into her long before marble floors and chandeliers ever surrounded her. She was raised in Newark, in a cramped two-bedroom apartment that smelled of disinfectant from her mother's hospital shifts and fried onions from the neighbor's kitchen. Her father wasn't there. He had walked out before her memory could anchor his face. All Celeste ever knew was the steady rhythm of her mother's exhaustion. 12-hour days at the hospital, then home with aching feet and a determination that her daughter wouldn't inherit the same burdens. "Stand tall, even when they want you to shrink," her mother often said. Words delivered not with soft encouragement, but with the conviction of someone who had lived her entire life overlooked. Celeste absorbed those words, pressing them into her bones. At school, she didn't have the privilege of being invisible. She was one of only a handful of black girls in advanced classes, and the expectation that she didn't belong followed her through every hallway. Teachers doubted her ability, classmates questioned her place. When she scored higher than others, whispers spread that she must have cheated. When she stayed quiet, she was labeled arrogant. Still, she studied harder, knowing that every grade wasn't just a number. It was proof. By the time she turned 16, she was juggling school with a part-time job at a diner. The uniform smelled of grease, no matter how much she washed it, but those paychecks helped cover rent when her mother's overtime wasn't enough. Later came shifts at a retail store, then late nights cleaning offices. Sleep became a luxury. Still, she pressed forward, holding on to the dream her mother had planted in her. That dignity came not from what others handed you, but from what you built with your own hands. College wasn't handed to her. It was wrestled into existence. Scholarships covered some costs, loans filled the gaps, and Celeste worked through weekends just to afford textbooks. Racism followed her there too, professors mistaking her for staff, classmates surprised when she spoke up with sharper answers than they expected. She didn't argue with their bias. She let her results dismantle it. Motherhood came earlier than she planned, but it didn't derail her. It became her reason. Raising her daughter alone meant sacrifice. Celeste wrote business proposals with a baby balanced on her lap, attended lectures with fatigue stitched under her eyes, and presented ideas to investors who dismissed her, not only for her race, but for daring to be a young mother in rooms full of men who had never been told no. Every rejection burned, but she turned the ashes into fuel. Her first company started in a borrowed office space no larger than a closet. She offered financial consulting to small businesses overlooked by big firms. Most clients were immigrants, minorities, or single parents trying to keep their dreams alive. Celeste didn't just crunch numbers. She fought for them. She understood what it meant to be ignored. Slowly, those clients multiplied. Slowly, the closet-sized office became a floor, then two. Investors who once laughed began to notice. But she never forgot the nights she skipped dinner so her daughter could eat. She never forgot the times landlords threatened eviction if rent was late. Those moments carved her into something the Hollisters would never understand: unyielding. So when Victoria Hollister spat the words, "You don't belong here," Celeste didn't hear them as truth. She heard them as echoes of every teacher, every classmate, every banker who once told her the same thing. And just as she had then, she stood tall, refusing to fold. Her silence in that ballroom wasn't weakness. It was history. It was survival. And it was strength that money alone could never buy. To the untrained eye, the Hollisters looked untouchable. Their family name had been printed in society pages for decades, their faces plastered across glossy magazines under headlines about polo tournaments and philanthropic luncheons. Their estates sprawled across the Hamptons, their yachts gleamed in harbor slips, their summer homes stretched from Palm Beach to Lake Como. To most, the Hollisters were the definition of old money: permanent, unshakable, eternal. But beneath the surface, the empire was crumbling. Charles Hollister knew it better than anyone. He had inherited vast skyscrapers in Midtown, luxury hotels that once brimmed with guests, and retail properties that had thrived in another era. But markets shifted, and Charles was no visionary. Corporations moved their headquarters to cheaper cities, travelers sought innovation instead of tradition, and online shopping gutted their retail revenues. What had once been assets were now anchors, bleeding millions every quarter. For years, Charles papered over the cracks with loans and promises. One property was sold to cover losses on another. Hotels were refinanced again and again until the interest alone outweighed their profits. He kept the creditors quiet with charm and handshake agreements, but charm couldn't balance a ledger. Victoria Hollister refused to acknowledge any of it. To her, numbers didn't define power, appearances did. She clung to the glitter of galas, to the photographs of her family in couture, to the illusion that as long as their names filled invitations, their empire remained whole. The night's gala was no exception. It wasn't about charity or celebration. It was theater, designed to project strength while hiding the desperation gnawing at their foundations. Preston and Isabella had inherited their mother's arrogance, but none of their grandfather's discipline. Preston squandered money as though it regenerated with every sunrise. Cars, clubs, vacations measured only in excess. Isabella polished cruelty into elegance, convinced her social dominance was enough to shield her from the storm her father faced daily. Neither grasped how precarious their world had become. The truth was brutal. The Hollisters' survival hinged on a single deal. $25 billion. A merger that would absorb their failing properties, restructure their debt, and restore confidence in their name. It was salvation disguised as business. Without it, their empire would collapse within months. That night, Charles had arrived at the gala already rehearsing his relief. The merger papers were nearly finalized. Soon, he told himself, the whispers about bankruptcy would vanish, and headlines would hail him as the man who secured the Hollister legacy. What Charles had never bothered to ask was who sat across the table. He had assumed his counterpart in the negotiations would look like him. Another man from old money, perhaps older, perhaps paler, but certainly familiar. The thought of a black woman leading the empire he needed to save his own had never crossed his mind. And so, when Celeste Morgan walked into the ballroom, when she stood there with her gown stained and her silence unbroken, the Hollisters didn't see her as the person holding their lifeline. They saw only what they had been conditioned to see, an intruder, an outsider, someone beneath them. The irony of their arrogance was lost on them in that moment. They mocked the very woman who held the pen poised over their future, the partner without whom their family name would become nothing more than an artifact of past wealth. The gala they believed would showcase their strength was, in truth, their last desperate display of power. And while they reveled in the humiliation of Celeste Morgan, they couldn't see that their empire teetered on her next decision. The laughter that followed Victoria Hollister's declaration didn't fade. It swelled. What began as a few cruel chuckles turned into a chorus, each voice trying to outdo the other in ridicule. It wasn't enough to see Celeste Morgan's gown stained with wine. The family wanted to see her spirit cracked open too. Preston Hollister led the charge. He raised his glass, sloshing champagne across the marble as though mocking the very accident that had started it all. "Careful where you step," he shouted, voice dripping with disdain. Wouldn't want the staff tracking wine into the kitchen. His companions roared with approval, clapping him on the back as if cruelty were wit. The crowd leaned closer, their laughter feeding off his arrogance. Preston thrived on it. He pointed toward Celeste's modest earrings, gleaming faintly in the light. "Now that's what I call subtle wealth," he sneered, stressing the word wealth as if it were a joke in itself. A banker's son doubled over, gasping through laughter. "Subtle? That's thrift store clearance." Phones rose higher. Guests angled themselves for the best shot, some zooming in on the ruined gown, others capturing Preston's sneer mid-toast. Within seconds, the spectacle wasn't confined to the ballroom. It was being streamed, shared, devoured by feeds outside those glittering walls. Not to be outdone, Isabella Hollister worked the room in her own way. She didn't shout, she whispered, soft enough to draw others in, but loud enough to spread like smoke. "I hear she slipped in without an invitation," she murmured into one guest's ear. To another, probably hoping to catch a rich man's eye, desperation looked so obvious. Each whisper carried, repeated, amplified until it became its own truth. Women in sequined gowns covered their smirks behind jeweled hands. Men in tuxedos chuckled openly, some turning to glance at Celeste with the dismissive amusement one might reserve for an unwanted performer who didn't know her act was over. The glee of the room sharpened into something uglier. It wasn't just laughter anymore. It was the pleasure of watching someone they deemed beneath them be reminded of her place. And beneath every word, every smirk, was the same message. "You do not belong here, not because of what you wear, but because of who you are. Still, Celeste did not react. Her hand held the black clutch loosely at her side. The phone within it glowed faintly, its screen catching the light. She didn't lift it, didn't announce anything, just held it, steady, like a quiet promise. The guards hovered near, uncertain. They looked to Victoria for instructions, but even they hesitated. Something about the stillness of the woman in front of them unsettled them in ways the crowd hadn't yet noticed. Preston pressed harder, desperate for the collapse that hadn't come. "Someone call housekeeping," he shouted, pointing toward Celeste with a grin so wide it nearly split his face. Laughter erupted, crueler this time, less like amusement and more like a feeding frenzy. But even as the room convulsed with mockery, her silence grew heavier. Every second she refused to break, stretched into discomfort for a few guests. A woman near the back lowered her phone, her smile faltering. A man at the bar shifted uneasily, realizing he had joined in without knowing why. Celeste's eyes never left the Hollisters. She stood with her chin lifted, her expression calm, her phone glowing softly against the marble light. The family thought they were in control, savoring every laugh at her expense. But what they couldn't see was that her composure was bending the room in a different direction, slowly, invisibly. Like the pull of a tide, no one notices until it's too late. The laughter should have crushed her. That was the point. The spilled wine, the jeers, the whispers designed to reduce her into an object of pity or rage. But Celeste Morgan didn't give them what they wanted. She stood rooted, her breath steady, her gaze unwavering. The more the room ridiculed, the quieter she became, and somehow that quiet began to carry weight. The guards, still hovering at the edges of the crowd, exchanged uneasy glances. Their orders were clear. Remove her once Victoria Hollister gave the signal. But orders were one thing, action was another. Something in her posture made them hesitate. She didn't look like someone being thrown out. She looked like someone who had chosen to stand exactly where she was, and that subtle difference unsettled men who were used to unquestioned authority. Guests noticed too, though they didn't admit it aloud. The laughter that had erupted in waves minutes earlier began to splinter. Some chuckles died halfway, trailing into silence as eyes lingered on Celeste's face. She wasn't broken. She wasn't even flustered. Her chin was lifted just enough to suggest defiance, her shoulders squared as though daring the marble hall itself to reject her presence. In her stillness, a voice from long ago echoed within her, the voice of her grandmother, a woman who had scrubbed floors and washed laundry for families who looked down on her but never managed to break her. "Never let anyone tell you where you belong," her grandmother had repeated, over and over, when Celeste was a girl struggling to understand why doors closed faster for her than for others. Belonging is not theirs to give, it is yours to carry. That refrain hummed through her blood now. It was the anchor that steadied her against the Hollisters' arrogance, against the mockery spreading through the crowd. Every insult hurled her way only reminded her of how many times she had already been told she didn't belong. Classrooms, boardrooms, negotiations where she was mistaken for the assistant instead of the strategist. She had faced this script before, and she had rewritten it every single time. The Hollisters expected collapse. They wanted tears, fury, a visible crack they could exploit. Instead, Celeste gave them dignity, and dignity proved harder to mock than weakness. It was an invisible weapon, silent, steady, unyielding. Preston Hollister grew restless. He tried again to provoke her, raising his voice above the thinning laughter. "Why so quiet? Cat got your tongue?" His smirk widened, but the response wasn't the eruption of laughter he craved. A few people chuckled politely, but others shifted, the amusement no longer as easy as before. Isabella leaned close to another guest, whispering more venom, but even her words lost some of their bite. There was no visible collapse to feed on. Celeste's silence was turning their cruelty back on them, making their malice look petty against her composure. The room began to fracture. One woman near the back set down her phone, no longer eager to film what was starting to feel less like entertainment and more like shame. A man at the buffet cleared his throat, uncomfortable under the weight of a spectacle that had lost its humor. Victoria Hollister narrowed her eyes, sensing the shift. She had orchestrated scenes like this before, subtle humiliations that reinforced her family's dominance. But this time, something was different. The woman in front of her refused to wilt. and the refusal itself was unraveling the performance. Celeste's silence wasn't empty. It carried history, sacrifice, survival. It carried her grandmother's voice and her own unbroken will. And now it was forcing the crowd to confront themselves, not her. The laughter faltered, the jeers weakened. The spectacle they had built was beginning to collapse under the weight of one woman's quiet defiance. And though no one realized it yet, that silence was the sound of power shifting. The ballroom had grown uneasy, the laughter thinning like smoke after a fire. Celeste Morgan stood untouched by the jeers, her silence heavier than the chandelier light spilling down on polished marble. Preston fidgeted. Victoria's smile tightened. Isabella whispered more frantically, but none of it mattered. Celeste had held her ground, and now she moved. Her hand slid into her clutch. The glow of her phone reflected faintly against her gown, catching the attention of the guards first, then the guests, then finally the family themselves. Phones had been raised all night to capture her humiliation, but now it was her phone that froze the room. She lifted it, not rushed, not hesitant. Every movement was deliberate, measured, as though the act itself was ceremonial. The crowd leaned closer, some raising their own phones higher, anticipating a desperate call for help. They expected pleading, they expected weakness. What they got instead were 3 calm words, spoken clearly enough to carry across the marble hall: cancel the deal. Silence crashed into the room. Conversation stopped mid-breath. The laughter dissolved in an instant. Glasses hovered mid-air as guests blinked, trying to make sense of what they had heard. Cancel the deal? What deal? Charles Hollister's face drained of color. His body stiffened, his practiced composure slipping for the first time all evening. Victoria's hand tightened around her clutch, the diamonds at her throat suddenly feeling like weights. Preston glanced toward his father, confusion flickering across his arrogance. Isabella's whisper faltered, her words drying in her throat, and then came the ripple. "She's the CEO," someone near the bar whispered, voice hushed with awe. "The CEO of Morgan Global," another corrected, louder this time. The words spread like a current, sweeping through the crowd. Each repetition sharpened the truth until it crashed into the Hollisters like a tidal wave. Guests who had mocked moments earlier now stared wide-eyed, realizing the woman they'd been laughing at was not a charity case, not an intruder, but the very partner holding the $25 billion lifeline to the Hollisters' failing empire. Phones that had been recording her humiliation kept rolling, now capturing the reversal. The steady woman with the glowing screen, the Hollisters paling as whispers filled the room. Clips streamed instantly onto social feeds. By the time dessert was served, the world beyond those walls would see what arrogance had blinded the family to. The Hollisters had mocked the one person they could not afford to offend. Victoria tried to recover. She stepped forward, voice sharp, brittle. This is outrageous. Who do you think you are?" But her words cracked under the weight of the murmurs rising all around her. A guest near the front turned deliberately toward her and said aloud what the rest had already pieced together. "She's Celeste Morgan. She owns Morgan Global." The reaction was instant. A collective intake of breath, followed by an audible shift in the room's energy. Guests began pulling their phones down, embarrassed to have been caught in the mockery. Some stepped back from the Hollisters' circle, suddenly unwilling to be seen as part of the humiliation. Preston's smirk collapsed. Isabella's eyes darted from face to face, searching for anyone who still seemed amused. Charles Hollister reached for his wife's arm, his whisper urgent, though no words could conceal the panic etched across his face. Celeste didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her voice had already done what silence could not. It had exposed them. She lowered the phone, her posture as calm as when she entered, as if she hadn't just detonated the foundation of the Hollisters' legacy with 3 words. The crowd understood now. The spectacle had shifted. Humiliation no longer draped across Celeste Morgan's shoulders. It clung to the Hollisters, heavy, undeniable, and broadcast to the world. And the night was only beginning. The words still lingered in the air, "Cancel the deal." And though Celeste Morgan had already lowered her phone, their echo thundered louder than any music the orchestra could have played. The marble ballroom, moments ago vibrating with cruel laughter, now pulsed with disbelief. Charles Hollister moved first. His voice cracked as he stumbled forward, hand raised in a half-hearted attempt at composure. "Ms. Morgan, wait, this is a misunderstanding. Surely we can discuss this." But the tremor in his voice betrayed the truth. He wasn't negotiating, he was begging. Victoria clutched his arm, trying to drag dignity back into her voice. "Yes, of course," she added quickly, forcing a brittle smile. These things can be smoothed over. We're all friends here." The room did not believe her. Neither did Celeste. She didn't shout, didn't defend herself against their sudden pivot. She didn't need to. Her silence now served a different purpose. It exposed the desperation they were trying to hide. Every strained word from the Hollisters only highlighted the reversal. The hosts who had spent the evening mocking her were now scrambling to cling to her favor. Guests caught the scent of weakness and turned on them. Whispers cut through the hall like knives. "They mocked her?" one voice said near the dessert table. "And she's the one keeping them afloat," another answered. "They've ruined themselves," a third murmured, this time not with cruelty, but with quiet satisfaction. Phones continued to record, but now the lenses turned toward the Hollisters. Their panic, their stammering attempts to rewrite the evening became the new spectacle. Guests edged away from them, unwilling to be captured standing too close to the collapse. Preston, red-faced, tried to reassert control. "It was just a joke," he blurted, his bravado crumbling with every syllable. "We didn't mean..." But Isabella hissed at him, her mask of elegance fractured. "Be quiet." Her eyes darted across the room, realizing every guest was watching, every guest judging. The whispers stung sharper than the laughter ever had. Celeste finally moved. She turned, her gown still stained, her clutch still in hand. She walked past the Hollisters as if they were nothing more than statues, her steps slow and deliberate, her expression serene. She did not pause when Charles reached out a trembling hand. She did not flinch when Victoria tried to speak again. She simply walked, each step puncturing the illusion of their authority. The doors loomed ahead, tall and golden, and as she neared them, the orchestra faltered before falling into silence. The music, like the laughter, had no place in what the room had become. At the threshold, Celeste paused just long enough for the cameras to catch her profile. Chin lifted, posture unbroken. Then she left, her exit a lesson written into the marble walls themselves. Dignity doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't need to. Behind her, chaos reigned. Charles barked orders at the guards. Victoria hissed instructions at her children. Preston tried again to defend himself, while Isabella begged the nearest banker to confirm the deal wasn't truly gone. But it was useless. The tide had turned, and the guests knew it. "She ended it," someone whispered. "$25 billion, gone," another replied. The Hollisters had mocked the one person who could save them, and in doing so, they had signed their own downfall. No one was laughing anymore. By the next morning, the ballroom scandal was no longer confined to whispers among guests. It was everywhere. Headlines ran bold across financial outlets. Morgan Global pulls out of $25 billion deal with Hollisters. What had been a lifeline for the Hollisters was now a public execution. Markets responded swiftly. Hollister Properties stock dropped 20% by noon, then another 15% by closing. Analysts predicted bankruptcy within months. Banks called in debts they had been willing to ignore just a day earlier. Creditors, no longer soothed by Charles Hollister's charm, demanded repayment in full. The illusion of untouchable wealth shattered almost overnight. Skyscrapers once associated with power now carried the stench of failure. Hotels emptied as corporate clients quietly shifted their contracts elsewhere. Retail partners severed ties. The Hollister empire, built on inheritance, maintained by arrogance, collapsed under the weight of a stain on a gown and 3 words spoken in defiance. But the financial implosion was only half the story. The real storm raged online. Videos from the gala spread faster than the falling stock prices. Clips replayed Preston's smirk, Victoria's command, "You don't belong here," and then cut to Celeste Morgan's calm voice, "Cancel the deal." Within hours, hashtags trended worldwide. "Cancel the deal," "Dignity costs," Celeste Morgan. Millions watched the reversal play out in real time. The billionaire family mocking a black single mother, unaware she was the CEO holding their empire in her hands. Comment sections filled with outrage and admiration. "Every black woman I know has lived a piece of what she went through that night. They thought they could humiliate her. She destroyed them with dignity." This is the power of quiet resistance. Even late-night hosts seized the story. One played the clip of Victoria sneering, "You don't belong here," before cutting to the headlines of the collapsed deal. His audience erupted in laughter, not at Celeste, but at the downfall of those who had mocked her. For weeks, the footage replayed on television, in boardrooms, in classrooms. It became a case study in arrogance and consequence. Universities discussed it under ethics and leadership lectures. Business panels debated it on live broadcasts, how a single act of public humiliation cost an empire everything. Meanwhile, Celeste Morgan became more than a CEO. She became a symbol. Interviews requested her presence, magazines clamored for her image. She declined most, issuing only a single statement through her company: "Dignity is not for sale." The simplicity of the line struck harder than any speech could. It was quoted in newspaper, painted on protest signs, printed on t-shirts. And for the Hollisters, humiliation continued to snowball. Prestigious friends who had once lined up to attend their galas began to distance themselves. Invitations went unanswered. Partnerships dissolved. Guests who had laughed alongside them now publicly condemned their behavior, erasing their own complicity with sudden outrage. The Hollisters found themselves isolated, mocked not for their wealth, but for losing it all in the most public way possible. Weeks later, when Charles Hollister tried to assure reporters the family was restructuring, his words fell flat. The footage from that gala drowned out every promise. He wasn't speaking as a titan of industry anymore. He was speaking as a relic of arrogance, stripped of power by a woman they had dismissed as unworthy. The world hadn't just witnessed a deal collapse, it had witnessed a reversal of history. One that proved arrogance can destroy, but dignity can outlast. And the lesson was burned into every headline: never underestimate the strength of the people you try to humiliate. Celeste Morgan didn't linger in the shadow of the Hollisters' collapse. While their empire crumbled in the headlines, she shifted her focus to what mattered most, using the very deal they lost to rewrite opportunities for those who had always been left out of the room. The $25 billion once earmarked for Hollister properties was redirected into a bold new initiative. Morgan Global announced the launch of the New Standard Fund, a sweeping program dedicated to supporting women entrepreneurs, particularly single mothers and founders of color, who were routinely overlooked by banks and venture firms. The announcement stunned the business world. Instead of burying her triumph in silence, Celeste turned it into a blueprint for change. The fund pledged to provide seed capital, mentorship, and access to global markets for thousands of small businesses. The very money that would have patched the Hollisters' sinking empire was now breathing life into new enterprises led by women who had stories not unlike her own. At the press conference, Celeste stood behind the podium in a simple gray suit, her voice steady, her words cutting through the noise of reporters clamoring for questions. "I was told once that I didn't belong," she said. "And for too long, too many women have been told the same thing, whether in boardrooms, banks, or classrooms. The New Standard Fund exists to make sure that ends here." Applause erupted, not just in the room but across the nation. Women shared the live stream with captions of gratitude and pride. Single mothers who had once felt invisible now saw a champion who carried their struggles into the halls of power and turned them into action. Critics called it risky, questioned whether prioritizing marginalized founders would yield returns. But Celeste's track record silenced most doubts. Within months, businesses funded by the New Standard were thriving. Restaurants opening in neighborhoods long ignored by investors. Tech startups led by young women of color, breaking into markets once locked against them. Childcare centers built by single mothers who knew exactly what their communities needed. It wasn't charity. It was empowerment. And empowerment, as Celeste knew, was far more sustainable than pity. Media outlets rebranded her as a visionary, a disruptor of an industry that had for decades funneled money into the same narrow hands. But for Celeste, it wasn't about the spotlight. It was about her daughter and the generations that would follow. She wanted a future where no girl would stand in a classroom and be told she was aiming too high. No woman would walk into a bank and be told her business plan wasn't credible because of her gender or her skin. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The Hollisters had sought to weaponize humiliation against her, to strip her of belonging. Instead, she used the same moment to create belonging for thousands. Where they tried to close a door, she built 1,000 new ones. And the narrative shifted. News anchors summarized it best. She didn't just cancel a deal, she built a movement. For Celeste, dignity had never been about proving the Hollisters wrong. It was about proving to every woman watching that strength doesn't come from the wealth you inherit, but from the resolve you refuse to surrender. The new standard wasn't just a program, it was a promise. A reminder that dignity once defended can multiply into opportunity for countless others. And it all began with a single woman who refused to bow when the world told her she didn't belong. What began as one family's mockery ended as a nation's lesson. The Hollisters believed their wealth gave them the right to decide who was worthy of belonging. They assumed their laughter could strip a black woman of her dignity, that a stained gown could reduce her to silence and shame. But what they failed to understand was that dignity is not fragile. It cannot be stolen by arrogance nor erased by humiliation. It is carried, generation after generation, by those who refuse to bow. Celeste Morgan walked into that ballroom, not draped in the extravagance they worshipped, but clothed in something far stronger: resolve. She carried the weight of her mother's sacrifices, the words of her grandmother who told her, "Never let anyone tell you where you belong." She carried the lessons carved into her life through struggle, rejection, and triumph. And in the face of mockery, she revealed the true imbalance of power. They mocked. She stood silent. They laughed. She remained still. They shouted, "You don't belong here." She answered with 3 words that ended their empire: "Cancel the deal." The reversal was more than poetic, it was necessary. Because the world needed to see them as not just cruelty. It is a weakness that can collapse dynasties. The Hollisters' empire was not undone by markets or mismanagement alone. It was undone by their arrogance, their refusal to see dignity in someone they believed beneath them. Celeste proved that quiet resistance can roar louder than cruelty. She proved that composure can outlast mockery. And most importantly, she proved that a single act of courage can ripple outward to create change far beyond one ballroom. From that humiliation came a movement. From that mockery came empowerment. And from her silence came a voice for countless women who had been told the same words: "You don't belong here." So now I want to ask you, what would you have done if you were Celeste Morgan, standing alone in that hall, facing the jeers of the powerful? Would you have spoken? Would you have stayed silent? Would you have walked away with the same grace she carried? Drop your thoughts below. I want to hear your perspective. And before you leave, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ, and share in the comments where you're watching from. Because stories like this remind us of a truth the Hollisters learned too late. Dignity is priceless.